There was something wrong, and the prisoners knew it. They just couldn't figure out what it was. These weren't stupid men. They were soldiers, German and Italian troops who had fought across North Africa, survived the desert, endured the battles. They'd been trained to observe, to analyze, to spot deceptions, and everything about their captivity in America felt like a deception. Except they couldn't prove it. They couldn't find the seam where the lie ended and the truth began. Because what they were experiencing contradicted everything, absolutely everything they had been taught to believe, and that contradiction would haunt them, night after night, meal after meal, until finally they had to confront a truth more unsettling than any battlefield, that everything they'd been told about America, about themselves, about the world, had been a lie. In the spring of 1943, thousands of Axis prisoners stepped off transport ships onto American soil. They'd spent weeks crossing the Atlantic, eating meals that made no sense, living in conditions that violated every prediction they'd been given. Nazi propaganda had promised them that America was weak, collapsing, a nation of mongrel races too divided to function, an economy too broken to sustain a war effort, a military too soft to fight. Italian fascist propaganda had taught them similar things. America was culturally bankrupt, materialistic, violent, a land of gangsters and criminals with no history, no values, no soul. The propaganda had been so consistent, so detailed, so confident that these prisoners had believed it completely. Why wouldn't they? It came from their governments, their teachers, their officers, their newspapers. It had shaped their understanding of the world since childhood, and now nothing added up. A German corporal, let's call him Hans because half the German army seemed to be named Hans, sat in the mess hall of a prisoners' camp in Kansas on his third day in America. He stared at his breakfast tray. 2 fried eggs, 3 strips of bacon, 4 slices of white bread with butter, a bowl of oatmeal, fresh orange slices, a cup of real coffee with real sugar, a glass of cold milk. Hans did the math in his head. This single breakfast contained more calories than his family in Munich received in an entire day. His mother, his sister, his young nephew. They were rationed to maybe 1,400 calories total, if they were lucky. And here he sat, an enemy prisoner, eating twice that in one meal. It didn't add up. The propaganda had been clear. America was on the verge of starvation. Their agricultural system was failing. Their supply lines were breaking down. Any day now, the American economy would collapse under the weight of fighting a two-front war. So why was the food so abundant? Hans watched as American mess hall workers threw away leftover eggs, perfectly good eggs, bacon, bread, just discarded because military regulations said food couldn't be held more than a certain number of hours. In Germany, throwing away food was a crime. People were arrested for wasting even a crust of bread. Here, Americans threw away more in a morning than Hans's family would see in a week. It didn't add up. An Italian private named Giuseppe had a different problem. He'd been assigned to work on an American farm in Nebraska, a sprawling operation owned by a second-generation immigrant family named the Johnsons. Giuseppe came from a village outside Naples where his family had worked the same small plot of exhausted soil for generations. They'd never owned the land. They'd sharecropped, giving most of what they grew to an absentee landlord who lived in Rome and visited maybe once a year. The Johnson farm was 500 acres, 500, and the Johnsons worked it themselves. Just the father, 2 sons, and during harvest, some hired help and POW labour. One tractor, a single machine, could plough in a day what would take Giuseppe's entire village a month with oxen. Giuseppe stood in that Nebraska field watching Mr. Johnson drive the tractor and tried to make it make sense. Fascist propaganda had taught him that Italy's system was superior, that Italian culture, Italian traditions, Italian social organisation were the pinnacle of Western civilization, that Americans were crude, unsophisticated, culturally inferior. Yet this inferior American farmer owned more land, produced more food, and lived better than any landlord Giuseppe had ever known in superior Italy. It didn't add up. The prisoners started comparing notes. In barracks at night, they whispered to each other, trying to solve the puzzle. Maybe the food was only good at their specific camps. Maybe they'd been sent to showcase facilities designed to look prosperous, but prisoners were scattered across 500 camps in 46 states, and the letters that managed to get through, smuggled messages, coded references, all told the same story. Abundance everywhere, Maybe the Americans were putting on a show, spending resources they didn't have to demoralize prisoners, but the show never ended. Weeks became months, months became a year. The food never decreased in quality or quantity, the waste never stopped. How long could a supposedly failing economy maintain a propaganda show? It didn't add up. Hans got assigned to work in a factory in Ohio. The factory produced ball bearings, small components for machinery, nothing glamorous. What struck Hans wasn't the product, it was the workers, women, dozens of them, operating heavy machinery, reading technical specifications, managing production quotas. Nazi ideology was clear about women's capabilities. Women were meant for children, kitchen, church. They weren't capable of technical work. They couldn't handle the intellectual demands of industrial production. Yet here were American women, not just one or two exceptions, but entire shifts of them, doing exactly that work, and doing it well. The production numbers were posted on the wall. The female shifts met or exceeded quotas as consistently as male shifts. Hans had been taught that Nazi Germany was the most advanced, most efficient industrial power on Earth, that German engineering and organization were unmatched. Yet this American factory, staffed partly by women who according to Nazi theory shouldn't even be capable of such work, was producing more, faster, with less waste than comparable German facilities Hans had seen. It didn't add up. The contradictions multiplied. German POWs had been taught that racial mixing destroyed societies, that diverse populations couldn't cooperate, couldn't build anything lasting, would inevitably tear themselves apart through ethnic conflict. Yet in the camps, in the factories, in the farms, they saw people of different backgrounds working together effectively. Italian Americans, German Americans, Polish Americans, Irish Americans, all mixing, cooperating, building, producing. There was tension, sure, there were prejudices. The prisoners could see that America wasn't some racial paradise, but it was functioning, it was producing, it was winning the war. How could an inferior, racially mixed society be defeating the racially pure master race? It didn't add up. The propaganda had taught them that democracy was weak, that democratic societies were too divided, too chaotic, too inefficient to compete with the focused power of authoritarian states. Yet the prisoners had access to American newspapers, and the newspapers openly criticized the government, reported on strikes, on protests, on political disagreements. In Germany, such criticism would earn you a visit from the Gestapo and a one-way trip to a concentration camp. In America, it was just Tuesday. And somehow, despite all this open criticism and debate and disagreement, America was still outproducing Germany in every category. More tanks, more planes, more ships, more guns, more food. How could a society that allowed dissent be stronger than one that demanded unity? It didn't add up. Giuseppe sat in the Johnson farmhouse one evening, invited in for dinner despite regulations that discouraged fraternization. Mrs. Johnson had made pot roast. There was enough meat on the table to feed Giuseppe's family in Naples for a month. The Johnson's son, Thomas, was about Giuseppe's age. He'd enlisted in the Marines and was somewhere in the Pacific fighting Japanese forces. Mrs. Johnson talked about Thomas while she served food to Giuseppe. She showed him a photograph. She worried about him, prayed for him, hoped he'd come home safe. Her son was fighting men like Giuseppe. Maybe not literally, Giuseppe had fought in Africa, not the Pacific, but the same side, the Axis, the enemy. And here she was, feeding Giuseppe like he was a guest, like he was a person, like he mattered. Giuseppe tried to process it. In Italy, you didn't break bread with enemies. You didn't show kindness to people who had tried to kill your sons. But Mrs. Johnson seemed to see no contradiction in treating Giuseppe with basic human decency, while her son fought his countrymen. "You're far from home," she said gently in simple English. "You must miss your family." Giuseppe nodded, not trusting his voice. "I hope they're safe," she said. "I hope this war ends soon and you all get to go home." It didn't add up. Fascist propaganda had taught him that Americans were selfish, that they only cared about money and individual gain, that they had no sense of community or compassion. Yet this woman, whose son was in danger because of people like Giuseppe, was worried about Giuseppe's family. What kind of selfish person does that? By the winter of 1944, the contradictions had become unbearable. Hans received a letter from home. It had taken 4 months to arrive. His sister wrote in careful, censored language, but the message was clear. They were starving. The rations had been cut again. There was no heat, coal was reserved for war production. The bombing had destroyed their neighborhood. They were living in a cellar. Hans read the letter in the camp rec room, surrounded by warmth, electric lights, and the smell of baking bread from the mess hall preparing dinner. He was warm, well-fed, safe. His family was starving, freezing, hiding from bombs. He'd been taught that Germans were the master race, superior, destined to rule. Yet the master race was starving while their inferior enemies lived in abundance. How does that work? How does the superior race lose to the inferior one? It didn't add up. The contradiction came to a head at Christmas. Across America, local communities organized Christmas celebrations for POW camps. Churches collected gifts. Families sent packages. Boy Scouts made cards. Hans received a package from a family in Kansas he'd never met. Inside was a wool scarf, hand-knitted, a bag of homemade cookies, a bar of chocolate, a small book, and a card. The card read, "Merry Christmas, we pray for your family's safety and for peace, from the Miller family." The Millers had a son serving in Europe. Hans knew because the card included a small photo, a young man in US Army uniform smiling at the camera. This family's son was fighting Germans, maybe had killed Germans, might die fighting Germans, and they'd sent a Christmas package to a German prisoner. They'd prayed for his family. They'd wished him peace. Hans sat on his bunk holding the hand-knitted scarf and felt something break inside him. It was one thing to see abundance and tell yourself it was temporary, to witness efficiency and convince yourself it was a regional exception, to experience kindness and dismiss it as strategic manipulation. But you can't sustain denial forever, not when the evidence accumulates day after day, meal after meal, interaction after interaction. Not when the contradictions become so overwhelming that maintaining your old beliefs requires more mental energy than accepting new ones. Hans finally admitted to himself what he'd been avoiding for months. Everything he'd been taught was wrong, not slightly wrong, not exaggerated, not bent by propaganda's distortions. Fundamentally, completely catastrophically wrong. America wasn't weak. It was the strongest industrial power on Earth. Americans weren't racially inferior. They were just people. Diverse people who had figured out how to work together despite differences. Democracy wasn't chaotic. It was resilient. It allowed criticism and debate and disagreement, and those things made it stronger, not weaker. The food wasn't propaganda. It was the result of agricultural abundance that Germany, with all its conquered territories, couldn't match. The kindness wasn't manipulation. It was genuine belief that even enemies deserved basic human dignity. And if all of that was wrong, then what else was wrong? What about the racial theories? What about the promises of a 1,000-year Reich? What about the guarantees of ultimate victory? What about the concentration camps that some prisoners were starting to hear whispers about? The ones Nazi propaganda said didn't exist, or if they did exist, were just work camps, nothing sinister. If the Nazis had lied about America, had they lied about everything? Giuseppe had a similar moment. His came watching a newsreel in the camp theatre. The Americans showed films from liberated concentration camps, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau. The footage was horrific. Skeletal survivors, mass graves, evidence of industrial-scale murder. Italian fascist propaganda had always insisted these stories were Allied fabrications, exaggerations, lies designed to demoralize the Axis. But Giuseppe sat in that theatre, watching footage that seemed too terrible to be fabricated, and felt his worldview crumbling. Because if you accept that the Nazis really did build death camps, and the evidence was overwhelming, then you have to accept that you fought for the wrong side. Not the losing side, the wrong side, the evil side. And Giuseppe looked at his own choices differently. He'd been conscripted, yes. He hadn't wanted to fight, but he'd still fought. He'd still fired his weapon at Allied soldiers. He'd still contributed, however reluctantly, to the Axis cause. The food he was eating, the kindness he was receiving, the dignity he was being shown, he didn't deserve any of it. The Americans should hate him. They had every right to. Instead, they were feeding him turkey and giving him Christmas presents and treating him like a human being. It didn't add up. Unless the Americans understood something fundamental that Giuseppe was only beginning to grasp. That being on the wrong side doesn't make you irredeemable. That soldiers often fight for countries and causes they didn't choose. That humanity matters more than nationality. That treating even your enemies with dignity isn't weakness, it's strength. By 1945, most German and Italian POWs in America had stopped trying to make it add up. They'd accepted what the evidence had been showing them all along. They'd been lied to, comprehensively, about America, about themselves, about how the world worked, and that acceptance changed them. Surveys conducted after the war showed that 74% of German POWs believed their captivity had changed their worldview. 61% expressed interest in democratic ideals. For Italian POWs, the numbers were even higher. 72% said their time in American camps had fundamentally altered how they saw the world. When asked what caused them to change, the most common answer wasn't the educational programs, or the propaganda films, or the lectures about democracy. It was the contradictions, the daily, relentless, undeniable contradictions between what they'd been taught and what they experienced. The propaganda had promised them American weakness. They experienced American strength. The propaganda had promised them cruelty. They experienced kindness. The propaganda had promised them chaos. They experienced order. The propaganda had promised them scarcity. They experienced abundance. And eventually the weight of accumulated contradictions became too heavy for ideology to bear. Hans returned to Germany in 1946. He walked through the ruins of Munich, through streets he barely recognized, past buildings that had been reduced to rubble. He found his family living in 2 rooms of a partially collapsed apartment building. His mother was thin, terrifyingly thin. His sister looked 20 years older than she was. His nephew was small for his age, stunted by malnutrition. They wanted to know what it had been like, being a prisoner, being in America. Hans tried to explain. He told them about the food, the abundance, the kindness, the contradictions. His mother didn't believe him. "It's propaganda, Hans," she said tiredly. "They were trying to demoralize you." Hans looked at his mother, this woman he loved, who had survived so much, and felt an overwhelming sadness. She was still believing the lies, still trusting the propaganda that had led Germany to ruin. "No, Mama," he said softly, "our propaganda was the lie. What I experienced in America, that was real." She stared at him, not understanding, and Hans realized that some people would never understand, because they hadn't been there. They hadn't eaten the food, met the people, experienced the contradictions. They hadn't had their certainty dismantled piece by piece, meal by meal, kindness by kindness, until accepting the truth became easier than maintaining the lie. But Hans had, and Giuseppe had, and thousands of other prisoners had. 3 years later, Hans immigrated to the United States. He couldn't stay in Germany, not because conditions were bad, though they were, but because he'd seen something different, something better, and he couldn't unsee it. Giuseppe did the same. In 1950, he brought his wife and children to America, sponsored by the Johnson family he'd worked for as a prisoner. They weren't alone. Thousands of former Axis POWs made the same choice. They returned to the country that had captured them, that had imprisoned them, that had shown them through overwhelming evidence that everything they'd been taught was wrong. Because that was the moment, not a single dramatic instant, but an accumulation of moments, of contradictions, of evidence that didn't add up, until finally, the only explanation was the one they'd been resisting. The truth. That America wasn't what they'd been taught. That their governments had lied. That abundance and kindness and democracy weren't weaknesses. They were strengths. That treating enemies like human beings wasn't naive. It was powerful. Powerful enough to transform enemies into admirers, prisoners into immigrants, defeated soldiers into American citizens. That was the moment they realized something didn't add up. And in that realization, everything changed. Because the truth has a weight that propaganda can never match. And once you've felt that weight, once you've lived in that truth long enough, you can never go back to believing comfortable lies. The math didn't work, the propaganda didn't hold. The contradictions were too many, too constant, too real. And eventually, inevitably, the prisoners stopped trying to make the lies add up. They accepted the truth instead, and the truth set them free.